So you saw the challenge that has been more or less is we face as clinical geneticists on a daily basis as to how we communicate the information, let's say from sequencing your entire coding sequence, which is give or take 30 million base pairs and generating on average about 7,000 variants, out of which probably there are 5 to 10 that are of clinical significance. So it's, I would say, an overwhelming amount of information. It's overwhelming for us who do that for a living, so to speak. Never mind about the person for whom that generation was generated. And so this is a genetic counseling challenge. And just as a way of coming to my part of the talk, in 2014 was the first year that supply did not actually meet demand. In other words, we have several positions of genetic counselors left without any person there, simply because there are not enough genetic counselors. So here is, since I realize a lot of people in the audience are not clinicians or have any more or less exposure to genetic counseling. Genetic counseling is a process of information. So it is the process through which we need to transmit the information that has been generated to the person who needs that information. And it is not a mechanistic process of just saying that's what we found, that's what it is. It is actually we have to, this information will need to be conveyed in a way that the person absorbs it, registers it, and hopefully translates it into some action. So it is a complex process, and it has been more or less it was introduced in the early 70s as an entire functional process, and it has been evolving since then. So of course, scaling up genetic counseling is something which we have been doing for a few years. And as you see here, we have two examples of video counseling sessions and, of course, phone counseling sessions. In fact, a video counseling session is done in many locales. It's also practiced here in India. It is done at the VA system in the United States. And it's simply you have the person remotely and you access the person and you have communicate with that person through a secure connection. Of course, phone counseling, telephonic counseling has been, it's a similar type of remote delivery of information. The difference there is that you don't look at the other person in the face. And I hope you realize, because this is, you really need, in order to have impact as a counselor, you really need to look at the person whom you are counseling, because there are a lot of things that are happening right there at once. You hit the person with information that sometimes could have devastating effects. And so being able to communicate and in real time gauge the reaction of a human being is critical in how successful you are in giving a counseling session. So with all these challenges that you heard, we really need to look into how we build a scalable solution. Something where taking into account what our manpower needs are, and taking into account the fact that the generation of information exponentially increases. And so how we can do that? We have something which has been done, some research has been done. And so people found that if we can automate or at least develop a workflow for collecting information that we need to have as a genetic counselor in order to be effective into our communication, I think that it helps us, first of all, number one, in minimizing the time that we spend, and number two, in getting accurate information in a standardized way. And so focus the counseling session, instead of getting general basic information, into delivering the message. So if you see how a genetic counseling session is structured, you see there are several components. And of course, these are the components that need to be in place and usually take place during a counseling session. So first one is you start by setting expectations. You really need to understand, the person needs to understand what a genetic counseling session is going to offer, and also the provider, the physician or the genetic counselor, needs to know what this person would like to find out, what information that person needs to know. So the other part, which is clearly critical, of course, is the demographic information and family history. We're dealing about genetic disease. Of course, genetic disease has the potential of being inherited. And therefore, we need to get the genetic history or the family history from that individual for that disease, or for that purpose for any other familial diseases that run in that family. And this is critical in terms of being able to get all the facts so that you can interpret the information correctly, the genetic data that you have collected. The third process, of course, which I probably should have put it in the beginning, is consent. This person needs to consent, first of all, for the sample to be, for the blood sample to be drawn, for the test to be done, for the information to be analyzed and possibly used in ways that this person has not necessarily considered when he or she gave a blood sample. So consenting is a critical part of counseling. Of course, the next part is interpretation of results. You have data there, how you interpret them. And we are not talking about medical interpretation. This is part which goes into the report that we sign off and send. It is interpretation of the results for the lay person. How the lay person understands that information. What does it mean for him or her? And finally, what is the next steps? This is what you would, in medical parlance, we would say, okay, what is the predictive history there? What does it mean for you? Okay, we identified this condition. What does it mean? It means that in 5 years' time, you are going to develop that symptom. In 10 years' time, you might require surgery, you might drop dead. I mean, this is important information. The other part is very good. We found that you have this change. Now, if you are in part of reproductive age, what is the chance that you will pass it on to any of your children? And are there any ways where you can prevent it? Are there ways to diagnose it prenatally? So you see that there is a complex web of questions that simple generation of information creates, but then you talk about decision making by the individual. So this is the layperson who is hit in one session with an enormous amount of information, and that person needs to incorporate it and more or less translates it to an action plan. Sometimes the information is so overwhelming and people run. when you have a counseling session. So if you give the information in a way that it is not impactful, it's kind of a waste of time and a waste of the information that was generated. So here is our challenge, how to build a comprehensive solution. And a comprehensive solution means that we include all the stakeholders in that story. The physician, the patient, the lab that will do the test, the genetic report, the person who generates the genetic report, and of course the counselor. And as you see here, each stakeholder has specific requirements and or needs. And let's start with the physician. The physician needs, by developing such a system, we create an open system or an open workflow as to that several people, providers or the patient, can access at any given time. So the physician will refer the patient to a portal, and of course the physician needs to authorize for a test to be done. That is what is also known as writing a requisition and signing it. So the next part is for the patient. So the patient goes to the doctor, and the doctor says, okay, you need to have that test, for which either you will provide a bit of saliva, or we'll have to draw a blood, or we have to do a biopsy, and that needs to be have genetic gene sequencing. So the sample is collected and of course shipped to the lab. So the patient needs, that creates a lot of anxiety to the patient. So the patient needs to have a way of tracking it as to where it is. Because sometimes it takes 6 weeks, 4 weeks to generate information. Well, how about if I tell you, start worrying, details to follow, because that's exactly what it is. Because the time you say that I suspect that you have this type of problem and we need to have this test done, and by the way, it will take 4-6 weeks to have the information, that creates a lot of anxiety to patients. And so we'll need to more or less have a system where the patient will be able to track where the information, where it is. Of course, the lab needs to post the results, and of course the report needs to be accessible by the physician and or the counselor. And finally, the counselor needs to have a way of getting access to that information so that can design his or her session with the patient. So there are going to be 3 slides here because I was shown that my time is over, where how we build a robust solution involving the different stakeholders, the physician, and you see what the physician needs to have actually in place for that system to be effective. The patient, how the patient needs to have access to that information and more or less track the information, and being able to schedule visits, and of course the genetic counselor as to how that person can access the information and therefore refer to material that needs to be in place before the counseling session takes place. In essence, what we're talking about automating a workflow platform which can be remotely accessed by several stakeholders, and that workflow will give a sense to all individuals where the process is and how they can actually access that and or ask questions. And obviously, where the future takes us, I would dare say that in a few years, even the counseling session, the final counseling session, is going to be more or less replaced or in some way interrupted by a sophisticated intelligent system where the patient at his or her own leisure, time, frequency can actually access a system and get questions and answers there. Of course, that system, we are not there yet, is going to take some time and will create a lot of questions by several constituencies, but that is how ultimately genetic information will be dispensed in a way that is both efficient and also patient specific. Thank you for your time.